So now that I've got you all here, for the sake of transparency and intellectual honesty, I have tagged my opposition to educate them properly on what craniometry is, what craniomorphology is, what racial typologies are, and on dating methods. Right? All of these and their distinctions, so that they are never conflated by these two again, right? Nor misrepresented without knowingly spreading misinformation. So that goes for words like Negroid, which we'll go over, is debunked. So we go ChatGPT, and just to be forthright, I'll show the prompt. So we go ChatGPT. So now that the butthurt egos, the pride, and their embarrassing attempts to sound intellectual, right, in their lives that they can't help but to drop me from, because I do not allow misinformation, right? Now that they can't cherry pick and misinterpret, it's time to get down to the facts. What is craniometry? What is craniomorphology? Why these dating methods are not to be conflated just because they're dating these skulls? And what are racial typologies? Y'all tune in for this.
1. Craniometry. What it is. Definition. Craniometry is the measurement of the skull, length, width, height, angles, capacity, ratios. Origin. Emerged in the late 18th and 19th centuries when early anthropologists wanted to classify humans as they classified plants, animals. Legitimate uses. Forensic anthropology, archaeology, reconstructing population history. Misuses. Became a cornerstone of racial science, used to argue that skull size shape determined intelligence, morality, or evolutionary advancement. 2. Craniometry and the birth of scientific racism. Samuel George Morton. Crania Americana. 1839. Measured hundreds of skulls, claiming Caucasians had the largest cranial capacity, most intelligent, Africans the smallest, Mongoloids in between. Paul Broca. France. Refined techniques, linking skull size to brain power and civilizational progress. These studies were biased. Data cherry-picked to fit a hierarchy that placed Europeans at the top. This became known as scientific racism, the attempt to give racist ideologies the appearance of objective science. 3. From craniometry to eugenics. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, craniometric findings were absorbed into the eugenics movement. Eugenicists argued that groups with smaller brains or primitive skulls were biologically unfit and should be controlled through sterilization, segregation, or restricted immigration. These arguments shaped laws in the US, colonial policies in Africa and Asia, and ultimately racial ideology. Craniometry provided the measurements, eugenics provided the policies. 4. The racial typology, Negroid, Mongoloid, Caucasoid, Australoid. Craniometry gave scientific support to the typological race model, the idea that humanity could be divided into a few fixed groups. Caucasoid, Europe, North Africa, West Asia, said to have long, narrow noses, high foreheads, large brains. Mongoloid, East Asia, indigenous Americas, said to have broad faces, flat noses, straight hair. Negroid, Sub-Saharan Africa, said to have prognathic faces, broad noses, long skulls, curly hair. Australoid, Australia, Melanesia, parts of India, said to share archaic traits like robust skulls and dark skin. These words became directly associated with craniometry because each category was defined by skull measurements and facial angles. Warning sign. Problem. Modern genetics shows these categories were false. Human variation is continuous, overlapping.
Modern genetics says that these terms are false. So when I call y'all pseudo, it's literally because y'all are pseudo. False. Liars.
And far more complex, especially in Africa, the most genetically diverse region. 5. Cranial morphology versus dating methods. It's important to separate two very different scientific activities. Cranial morphology, what it is, the study of skull shape and features, long versus short skulls, broad versus narrow faces, prognathism, etc. Use, helps identify population variation, evolutionary adaptations, and migration patterns. Limitations, shape can overlap across populations. Environment, diet, and plasticity influence cranial features. Cannot reliably define race. Example, early South American skulls, Lagoa Sana, Brazil, resembled Australians Melanesians, showing early migration diversity. But this does not mean those groups were the same race. But this does not mean those groups were the same race. Does not mean those groups were the same race. Empirical dating methods, what they are, tools to determine the age of fossils, independent of their shape.
Independent of their shape, meaning craniometry has nothing to do with craniomorphology. You see the difference? Craniometry, cranial morphology, you conflated the two. And we're talking about dating systems. We're not talking about trying to shape a skull to figure out what race it is.
Key methods. Radiocarbon dating. Measures decay of carbon-14 in organic material. Good up to 50,000 years. Potassium argon. Kr. Dating. Measures volcanic layers. Good for fossil 100,000 years. Uranium series dating. Measures radioactive decay in bones or cave deposits. Optically stimulated luminescence. OSL. Dates sediments by last sunlight exposure. Stratigraphy. Relative dating based on soil layer position. Use. Provides objective chronological context. When people lived, not what race they were. Check mark. Summary. Edification. Craniometry. The measurement of skulls. In the 1800s, it was misused to build racial hierarchies. Scientific racism and eugenics. Craniometry proved Europeans superior and Africans inferior, feeding policies of oppression. Typological race terms. Negroid, Mongoloid, Caucasoid, Australoid. These were constructed categories built from craniometric measurements and stereotypes. Now debunked. Cranial morphology, the scientific study of skull shapes to understand variation and migration, valid but limited. Dating methods, radiocarbon, potassium argon, and others. These are empirical, objective tools to determine fossil age, not tied to race categories. Backhand index finger pointing right. In short, craniometry created racial myths, while modern morphology and dating methods replaced those myths with real science about human history.
What?